Everyone, and welcome to Week in Review with the incomparable Doooovid, who's had a great week this week, and he'll be regaling us with stories from his new adventures. But before that, over to you, Doooovid, for a song.
Yeah, I think it's been good practice starting the week with a song, setting kind of a spiritual tone. So anyone who knows anything about Judaism, this was I'm going to screen share some like happenings and people get a feel for like ethnic Judaism in Israel. There's a famous Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai who is credited with being the author of the Zohar, the most famous Kabbalist in all of history, and he passed away Thursday. That was the anniversary of his death, like 1800 years ago. He was a rebel in the time of the Romans, where the Romans had taken over Israel and it was forbidden to teach Judaism. He was a student of the famous Rabbi Akiva, who was martyred by the Romans, and he had built up 24,000 disciples, and then all his disciples died, according to tradition, was for baseless hatred. They didn't respect each other enough, and therefore they all died off. And Rabbi Akiva, even though all his 24,000 disciples died off, he goes on and recruits a few more disciples, one being Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai, who is the teacher of the Kabbalah. So this is by his grave, and Meron is a town in northern Israel. This is the rabbi. He's my most popular video, almost 8,000 views of a chanting song that this rabbi used to chant, lighting a fire. So people light fires in memory of this rabbi. People make pilgrimage, and he's got a lot of these. The story goes that Rome had been forbidden to teach Torah, Jewish wisdom in Israel due to the rebellion of Bar Kokhba. People who know that history, and Rabbi Shimon was fearless, and he kept on teaching Torah. His master Rabbi Akiva had been tortured to death, and he praised God with his dying breath, and God forbid the story of his torture is well recorded in literature. And so he hides in a cave for 12 years and receives supposedly like all the hidden wisdom of Judaism. And then he comes out, and it says he comes out, he can't relate to like simple people. He sees farmers and people going about their regular daily life, and he's burning them up, just his vision. He was like, how could you not see the spiritual, serve God? How are you caught up with this mundane nonsense? And God says, did you come here to destroy my world? And he goes back into the cave for one more year, and then he comes out and becomes kind of like the champion of everybody, and was known to be able to read souls, tell the purpose of people, forgive people's sins, and different things. So there's famous songs. This video, I'll put the link in the chat if people want to see some authentic Jewish chanting. And this is a famous song that they sing. I'll just sing a few verses. Via Martin Kolachai, there means like cheek, and all the cheeks, all the mouths will say Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai. All the cheeks will say Rabbi Shimon, the righteous man. And he's got a bunch of verses that talk about his praises. The last verse, Torasi Mugain Loni, his Torah saves us all. He me'ira Saneni, who lightens up our eyes, who yaklivs to Elenu, and he spreads good upon us, our master Bar Yochai. And a lot of these kind of like, he would be able to forgive people of their sins and judge people favorably, that people wouldn't know what they're doing with their life or why they're doing it. But Bar Yochai, and they got these great songs, so I'll just sing a verse or two of this. Torasi Magen Lanu, Hi Mirasanenu, Uyamlis Tovalenu, Adonenu Bar Yochai, Veya Martin Kolachai, Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai, Veya Martin Kolachai, Rabbi Shimon Sadikai. Pesach Bechakma, Hoitzi or Teuluma, Titen Zarachama, Adonenu Bar Yochai, Tzadik Yesodo. So there's a bunch of songs where they go singing his praises. But I thought it was relevant this week. One thing, because this happened this week, and the kind of taking your average person, being to find their special purpose, and judging people favorably, even though people may appear that they're doing silly, worthless things, but from a greater spiritual level, like, oh, you don't know that there's some, godly purpose and some greater spiritual things that help explain what no one else could understand. And that's why you see 1800 years later, hundreds of thousands of people make pilgrimage to his grave. Like everyone's heard of Kabbalah, even non-Jews, or the power of Kabbalah. And, Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai is the master of Kabbalah, who, even in the Roman times where the punishment was death for teaching these teachings, he was fearless and relied on God. And, that's why he's remembered today. So I guess people wandered in. Hopefully, that was interesting.
Thanks for sharing, Doovid. So I'm really excited for the week in review this week. It's been a pretty interesting week. It seems like a lot of stuff has been happening. A lot of these streams are getting increasingly more viewers, and people are sort of going in new directions. So where would you like to start off? Would you like to talk about your trip to the meeting for the ADL, and we can play that recording that you made?
Yeah, I'll do the quick, just week in review. I didn't join any of the popular streams this week. This guy, Charles Moskowitz, who's got a radio show where he goes by Chuck Morris in Boston. I was on his show. I'll put the link to it, and he saw me with E. Michael Jones, and he's a conservative talk show host in Boston, and he's got a decent show. He invited me on. He actually reached out like 2 weeks ago, and he gave me his phone number and email, and I replied on Twitter, and he didn't come back, so I eventually called his number, and so that was a good show. We talked about Jewish views on Jesus, and he's an interesting conservative talk show host, and he's interviewed Claire and like Richard Spencer, E. Michael Jones, but he also has a lot of like mainstream Columbia, Harvard professors. He had a professor from Harvard earlier in the week in Columbia, so that was good to get more mainstream. I had in real life. I recorded a zoning meeting in Detroit, which is we could talk about identity and kind of like, okay, I talk like my identity as a Jew, but I rarely talk about my identity as like a civil engineer, as property management. So in real life, I went to the zoning meeting about zoning changes in Detroit, and I put it up on my YouTube page. So that was pretty good, although it might be hard to watch unless someone's interested in that. And then it turned out that the head Thursday night, the head of the ADL, Jonathan Greenblatt, who was pretty infamous, came to Metro Detroit and did a town hall at the local Jewish community center, and it was pretty packed. Like 300 people came, and he did an overview of like his history, how he got involved, what the ADL is doing, and then he took questions, and I asked a question about dealing with trolls, and he answered, and I'll put it on screen share one second real quick, just so show my picture. So I got my picture of Jonathan Greenblatt, and he's on mainstream news. Like anytime, God forbid, there's like big things with the Jewish community and like censorship or anti-Semitism, he's basically our spokesperson. And his background isn't religious Judaism. His actually background's business. He was an economic advisor to President Obama. He worked with Google and Starbucks, and he's got a lot of expertise in algorithms and social media. But he knows like Mark Zuckerberg and Sergey Brin, and he's the guy who shuts you down. But he came and I met him. He was kind of cool. And I guess hopefully Jennifer will play the question just to show, like I was mentioning, like, I got a lot of trolls. So can you see my screen?
Yes, I think it's being shared right now. So I can pull up the...
Well, I just want to show, because I mentioned, like, how do you deal with trolls? So obviously, like the ADL is the one shutting down trolls, having hate speech and all these algorithms, and the ADL is the advisor for YouTube, the platform we're on right now. ADL is basically the one that has the power of deciding how hate speech and what should be allowed or not allowed on. And I'm thinking, like, I got a lot of trolls. I got 144 followers on YouTube, and like I don't know. I mean, maybe European revolution, fighting the anti-white hegemony, advocating a revolution in consciousness. I don't know if he's a troll, but I don't know. And I have no idea who a lot of these people are, or, Donalito, Drumpolini. I mean, think, John Frances, he's following me. John Morgan, number 2 for Greg Johnson. I mean, not all these people are trolls, but like a lot of these people following me are like pretty blatantly trolls, pretty blatantly like even like anti-Semitic, and it's tough to know like like what do you do with these people, and so I asked him about engaging him. Usually I'm pretty friendly. I'll speak to people, I'll hear their complaints, and like that's how I got relatively my infamous or fame on YouTube is arguing with colloquial what the ADL would call anti-Semites. And so I asked him about engaging trolls, and you'll see his answer. He was like, block them, ban them, report them. That's kind of what he said. So, obviously I'm not as hardcore as the ADL, and it's different when you're in a position of authority, arguing from strength. But so you could see the town hall. I encourage people who want to know more about the ADL. If you want to play that, clip, go ahead.
Sure thing. I've got it screen shared here to about the 103-minute mark, which is, I think, where you pop in.
Support the people who support you. Hannah, you've got a question right here.
Thank you, Mr. Greenblatt. David Kelton, local Jew. I promote social media supporting local synagogues, and I have hundreds of, I would call them trolls, that follow me, and I've engaged in a lot of debate, largely centering around like immigration, multiculturalism, some of it to success, convincing, dispelling untruths. How productive do you think it is to engage, so to say, the trolls, people with honest questions, and then when it comes to a point where that's basically all I do is debating immigration and type issues?
I'll tell you, David. So I can speak for myself, and I'd like George to jump in too. But David, I don't ever respond to trolls. I don't ever dignify them with my time. I don't want to legitimize them with my attention. And so depending on how many followers you have and how public these back and forths can be, I just don't do it. So it might be successful for you, but I find so often that the people who show up on social media have already made their minds up. So my advice about trolls is to either ignore them, block them, or report them if you have a chance.
I don't.
Okay, so
You could play the woman real quick. The local Michigan ADL director responds for a few seconds. You could do another few seconds.
Oh, sure.
Either. I usually within 24 hours try and post something on my personal page that is more proactive myself, but I don't respond. In fact, we got one earlier this week, didn't we, Emily? And we don't respond. I'm going to take another question.
Okay, so that was it, and I waited around afterwards, and I got a selfie, and so the ADL. I mean, if you watch the video, you see there was a pretty packed town hall, and a lot of people asked questions, and obviously Jonathan Greenblatt is arguing from a position of strength. He's probably a multimillionaire. He was, he's buddies with Sergey Brin and Mark Zuckerberg, and is head of a huge organization that works together with the FBI and law enforcement. So when you're in a position of strength, it's different than a position of weakness where you could just be like, block them, ignore them. Not everyone else has that luxury to do that.
Well, I think the challenge for me just watching this exchange is, how do you know when someone is a troll versus when they have a legitimate question?
Yeah, I mean, it's tough to tell. So, I mean, sometimes it's the handle. So, I mean, if the guy is like calling himself, like, you could a lot of time tell from the handle. And it's kind of like Gandalf, so, okay, you know who the guy is. You're friends with him on Facebook. And then he comes on YouTube, and he chooses like the handle Gandalf, and you have like the Luke Ford's talked a lot about the dangers of the e-personality, but I think the name is one of the clearest indications of that the person uses, and then like sometimes it's pretty obvious that the person chose a name for a specific purpose of let's say harassing Jews or something like that, and maybe they have multiple purposes. Someone like Norvin, who might not be a troll, he might have anti-Semitic thoughts and beliefs, but he's choosing a name that shows that he's a personality. He's promoting paganism or whatever his ideas, versus someone that calls himself like, God forbid, like Hitler or Goebbels or Sheckelstein or something like that. So I think the name is the biggest indication, and then the content. So he's like high testosterone, who he might be a respectable person, and he seems to know some kind of content. He's intelligent, but he's kind of in the troll category. Or if it's even a guy like Brundlefly, who's like telling you like, like, I'm a racist. The reason I'm not showing you my name, and I can't tell you who I am, is because my views and opinions are unacceptable in mainstream society, and he might lose his job and his family if people knew who he is. And then or even like Will to Power or something like that, where he's basically saying like, I'm a racist, I'm scared to admit it, I'm scared to show my face and use my real name, but I'm here to espouse racist beliefs. And you say, okay, maybe Will to Power is not a troll, and you're saying, no, he's a legitimate racist. And there's a reason why he's not using his name and face, because of people like the ADL, and because of censorship, and because his opinion would be there would be consequences to his opinion if people knew who he was. And so it's interesting from like the ADL's perspective, a position of strength, where he's got the ear of the CEOs of Facebook and Google to just kind of say like, block him, kick him off, call the FBI, have him arrested, saying, okay, we might not have that power, saying these people are trolling me. What could I do? I could, beg Jonathan Greenblatt to like, deal with my trolls, like tell Sergey Brin to, give me some breathing room for all my trolls. I'm not sure.
Yeah, I encountered trolls sometimes as well. It's a bit of a challenge, because I like to have debates. I don't like to shy away from debates, no matter how challenging they are. But then I kind of realize as well that some people aren't interested in a debate. They're just, I guess they're interested in something else. And so at some point I have to sort of disengage and stop paying them attention, which they're not.
We're going to talk about Claire, but Claire's obviously not a troll. She's using her real name. So he's in conversations in good faith versus trolling. So got Chris Elton here. Brundle is not exactly a troll. It depends, like, what do you mean troll? So these definitions are. So if you're saying you enjoy debate, and you enjoy, so to say, like, I like multiculturalism and diversity and immigration, so my main people to debate are racists. So you're not going to get like mainstream racist. You get like David Duke or Patrick Little or something like that. And I've actually debated a lot of those people, like Richard Spencer or something, the people who are going to show their name and face and have some form of renowned for arguing these positions of the word racism might be a negative term, but how, nationalist, however you want to look at that, versus just your average guy like OV, Faustian, like a lot of these guys online, that there's countless, there's tens of thousands of these guys who just have the like Brutus the British or something like that, where they're basically here to promote what would be classically just called racism, and they're not using their real name or identity, and they're basically from some perspective full of hate. And we say, well, but I agree with them. Immigration and demographic change is a serious problem, and someone has to address it. And maybe we could get more into that with Claire and your week in review. But it was interesting. The head of the ADL came to Michigan, and like, I'm a Jew in Detroit, so like I know I'm pretty involved in the Jewish community. So he came to speak to Jews in Detroit, and I got to meet him. I got to address some of my concerns. I got to ask a question at the town hall. I got to put it up on my YouTube page. In some respect, I thought that was pretty cool. And JF retweeted it, and No Apologies retweeted it, and that's actually the most liked retweet I ever had. I think I got like almost 80 likes on the retweets from that post, and although most of the comments were negative because the people look at the ADL as like the boogeyman. They're the reason why you can't just do whatever you want on YouTube.
Well, congratulations for the tweet. That's good news. You got the exposure there. So yeah, just coming back to this idea of censorship and things like this, I guess I try to have protocols. So if someone wants to talk to me in good faith, I'm happy to do it, even if they have unpopular opinions. But if someone, like, I guess you're saying you think Claire is legitimate. I don't really feel that she is, just based on the tactics that she uses. I think are quite defamatory.
Well, I mean, I could agree with you. I just mentioned the thing that she's using her real name. You could search her up on the internet, and she has legitimate credentials. I'm saying she's a lawyer. She was banned from British politics. That's all blatantly up there. It's not like someone like Faustian Spirit or Will to Power or Brundlefly, where you have no idea who this person is.
Oh, okay. Yeah, I guess there is something to be said for using your real name, because I think it makes
and having a reputation. So I mean, it's not just if it's someone, if it's like I mean, I guess Josh Neal's not using his real name, or Kyle Rowland, or but if it was let's say someone on Luke Ford who's just using their real name, but they're so to say, God forbid, nobody, there's no information, they're just Joe Schmo from Podunk Town, and they don't have anything behind them, as opposed to Claire, who not only is she using her real name, but she's got credentials, saying like, if you're into nationalism, she was officially a party member of NKIP, so if you're in white nationalism, Claire is pretty advanced in that, and all you have to do is search Google.
Yeah, I find her commentary really funny. She says that the things that you say actually increase anti-Semitism, and that's why so many Jews disagree with what you do. But she doesn't seem to have any self-awareness that she's also a minority, and her opinions also tend to increase anti-minority sentiment because of how bossy she is and how condescending she is. It's really funny how little self-awareness a lot of people can have when they do things like that. It's like, I don't think Claire is making anybody associated with her look better, to be honest. And that's why I cut her off. Like, I don't like that she's constantly writing about me on her tabloid blog, and constantly, it's mostly because she misrepresents what I say. I don't know if you ever watch our streams, but every single thing that I say, she kind of twists it and represents it to me, and then asks me to affirm her like twisted misrepresentation of what I'm saying. So it ends up just being this battle of me being upset that she's not quoting me properly, and then her being like, well, that's what you said. I mean, it's right there. But it's like, I don't know if this is just her debate strategy, but I find it distasteful.
Well, if it's not an overlap in interest, where me and you at least have the area of overlap of interest, the quantum consciousness and reincarnation and the quantum mind, and so we could always fall back on our area of common interest, where you and Claire don't necessarily have an overlap of common interest. That you might have the overlap where it's saying, okay, I don't know how much interest you have in nationalism or white identity, and so Claire, even though she's not white, has credentials in that. So if you were interested in white identity and nationalism, Claire could be very useful, because she knows the big names. She's got a big name in that field, even though she's not one of them, even though she's an opponent. And but besides for that, and you're like coming from the Luke Ford show or the streaming type thing, you're just a victim of circumstance. So, being conceived in sin, that we met on the Babs cast, so to say. So our relationship was conceived in sin from the very beginning. And that's what you get. You met in a bad situation off the Luke Ford show, off the Babs cast, and hence, like, of course, you're caught up with these like ragtag group of one big unhappy family, or however you want to describe this.
I'm not sure what you mean by conceived in sin. What is it about Babs' show that is sinful in your view?
Well, I mean, Babs is basically the overspill room of the Luke Ford show, and Luke Ford is basically infamous. I think anyone, it's kind of like Claire. Like, you could look up. Luke Ford has a Wikipedia page. Claire's got a wiki. I don't know if she has a wiki. I think she has a Wikipedia page also. I don't have a Wikipedia page. Like, I mean, my name, I'm doxable, but there's not really too much. Just say like, okay, I'm a random Jew from Detroit, an engineer, a chess player, but there's not really too much information on me. But Luke Ford, the information known about him is basically bad. Saying like Wikipedia says, blatantly the first line that he's got like narcissistic personality disorder. He's got pornography. He was excommunicated from Judaism. So a lot of the information about him is negative. So you say like, oh, I met Doooovid off the Luke Ford show, and just saying like, well, isn't that kind of like negative? I mean, God forbid it just be like, oh, like I met this person like at the house of ill repute. It was like, well, I'm not surprised the relationship didn't work out.
Yeah, I guess I don't really see it that way. I kind of see Luke Ford as maybe tabloid tier, right-wing commentator, e-personality type thing. I guess he does have that history. And, if you want to judge him based on that, that's fine. But, yeah, I guess the porn...
You say conceived in sin might be a little too strong, but I mean, saying like, yeah, of course, like if most of the people you're talking to online you met are from the Luke Fordosphere, of course most of the like Brundlefly and all these people, it's going to be relatively negative because it was don't like the metaphor being conceived in sin.
No, I'm just kind of struggling to understand it, because I guess from my perspective it's better to talk about things and get a consensus, and that makes it a lot easier to move forward. But now it kind of seems like there's this guilt by association where people are going to judge you not just based on what you say, but also based on who you associate with. So it becomes this whole big production to sort of establish, well, who do I talk to? And then it just kind of seems like it's going to result in echo chambers, because you're only going to talk to people who are in line with, political correctness, or however you want to word it.
Well, so when Charles Moskowitz reached out to talk to me, and I mentioned, my streaming history and Luke Ford, and he never even heard of Luke Ford. I mean, he heard of E. Michael Jones. He found me from Brundlefly, show, and that E. Michael Jones reposted on his channel. And then I mentioned Luke Ford to Charles Moskowitz. He said he never heard of him.
Yeah, I guess he's a bit fringe. From what I've been hearing from a lot of people, Luke Ford's show has been coming up in their suggested YouTube videos.
Was it not as a fringe, but the information, like Claire is saying, like, I mean, Luke Ford's not, you could call Luke Ford a troll, but I'm saying because he's using his real identity, and like Claire, you could call her a troll, but because she's using a real identity, and but the information that comes up about her is largely negative.
I guess I consider her a troll because, I mean, she can't possibly believe that her approach will work. I mean, she basically wants to have a list of Jews that if you fail to live up to the standards of, I'm not sure what exactly, Torah law maybe, but if you don't do that, then you're sort of struck off this list and you're not allowed to function as a Jew anymore, whatever that means. And to me, that seems extremely... It's
an idea. I'm saying, like, I mean, I told her, like, I don't think too many Jews would go for it. And, but I mean, if you think about it, like, she's in London. London has an Islamic mayor. London is less than half white. And she's basically like, like, white man, Europe, you lost. Like, stop crying, stop, this and that. And even like all the white nationalists, she's like, like, she knows your leader. So if you're just like a guy like Will to Power or OV, who, started looking into things, maybe used to be liberal, and, considering, you're trying to support your people or change demographic change, Claire's already the end game for you. So either you got to look at who has, who's already fighting these fights, who's already, doing this, and you come on to like, Richard Spencer, Greg Johnson, E. Michael Jones, like all the names in the field, like, so saying, she's already the end game, like you're saying, like she already knows, has spoken, has contact. She was already part of the political party. She was the lawyer representing them. So you can say, okay, like, you're not white, you're Muslim. How the hell does being a white nationalist lead to being friends with Claire? And maybe that comes into the concept of a token, where a person sees kind of like their low rank, or what could they provide, so to say, for the movement. And I noticed that I think you had your stream of like Will to Power, and if you want to pause for a second and talk about your streams before I come back and kind of tie that into, kind of like, if you look at like Will to Power, I'm not sure if he looks at it like a pro-white movement, like he's talking to you and he thinks like that his YouTube conversations are benefiting the white people. And then there's a certain rank type order where you're saying, well, fall in line. Claire outranks you. She's not white. She's not even pro-white, but she outranks you. And, presumably if you want to join the movement, you're going to fall in line in the senior leadership. And that puts you lower than Claire. And that's kind of like how I give the example of like the token at the club, like the token black or something like that. So you might be like white and trying to get into the all white club, and there's like this token black guy there. But even though you might, be white, and you might feel like, well, you should be able to be a member, but there's this token black guy in the club. How do you deal with that guy? And there's a certain gatekeeper period where for whatever reason you have to make alliances, and these people have already made these alliances, and then you have to deal with the people they've made alliances with, or you have to try to start your own structure. So if you try to start your own structure, you start from ground zero, and it's like, well, how many white people do you know? Like 4, 2, 3, 0, and you're going to try to build a base, or you're going to try to work with the already existing structures, and they're just going to charge you money. Like Ameren Conference, like John Morgan, till like he's Greg Johnson's number 2. I'm kind of friendly with him. We obviously disagree. That in many, like, how could I be friends with a white nationalist? Because there's a certain intellectual respect, or respect among oppositions. But what are you going to do? You're going to go to Skansa Forum. You're going to go to Ameren. You're going to donate a bunch of money to this cause. You got to work your way up the ranks. And someone like Claire, she's already done that. She already has an establishment foothold within these circles.
I guess I don't really see it that way, to be honest. I mean, I don't really know anyone who supports Claire's vision, and I don't really think she has much.
It doesn't matter whether they support their vision. It's saying, like, if you go, I mean, I give you the example, like the all-white club that has, God forbid, like a token black member. So, like, what does the token black member think? It doesn't matter what he thinks. Like, he might have some vision, he might have some understanding, he might, whatever. Claire is like the token Islamic member of the white nationalist movement. It doesn't matter what she thinks, but the point is, she understands this stuff. She's not going to be stopped at the door. She's gonna garner entrance. So no matter what her wacky ideas are, when all the white nationalists gather, for whatever reason, Claire's going to get past security and be inside with them.
Right. Well, that just sort of tells you that these, quote, white nationalist organizations are probably not really serious, right? So why would I want to be associated with people who aren't serious?
Well, no, they might be serious. You need allies. You need support. It's just like, if you look at the opposite on the big picture, where generally the white man, Europeans, the West, has sided with Israel. So you're looking like Iran, like E. Michael Jones, David Duke. These people have sided with Iran. They went to Iran for the conference, and they're like, stop fighting the wars for Israel with them, even like no apologies. was saying, but your legitimate Westerners have basically taken the side of Israel against Iran and these different Islamic forces. So if you're saying, I'm not going to follow their pattern, let's team up with Iran. And, or, so, but it just goes to the geopolitical necessity of having allies, and the people who've been in the game longer, for whatever reason, these are the allies that they've worked in. So, the people coming in, like, I don't want to be Israel's ally. Well, it's like, well, too bad. If you're in the West, Israel's your ally.
Okay, I guess it's a bit tricky for me to navigate what exactly it is that you're saying, because I feel like you're kind of jumping between political and meta-political movements. I think it's pretty clear that these white nationalists don't actually have any political power, and so you're in the meta-political domain where I guess there is some
They have a tiny bit of power.
Sorry?
You're saying, like, they have a tiny bit of power, like saying they actually have a political party in London, and I guess they have 0 seats in Parliament. They don't have any seat, but they actually have a party that runs in elections. So it's like, if you're in Canada, Justin Trudeau, you're an ally with Israel, whether you like it or not, because that's the decision your government made. And should you want to change that and be like, I don't like Canada being an ally with Israel, I think we should turn against Israel and side with Iran, you would have to go about creating your own political party. And I've had all these conversations and debates with the different people on the alt-right, like the balkanization. But so it's like, okay, you're going to have to form your own coalition, new coalition, in like Faustian spirit, and start winning local elections and eventually run in larger elections. And then you think, well, obviously people have been trying that, and the people who tried that to form a political party in England, somehow Claire became their lawyer and was even on their ticket.
And I believe she was kicked out of 2 British political parties. Is that right? I mean, what do you say to people who just don't believe that there's any political solution? Because that's clearly what evidence supports.
Yeah, so if you're in England and you're upset with the current direction of your country based on like demographic change and white nationalism, so you could be, like, okay, I need to start my own political party. And you could look at the current political parties. That's why Brutus the British invited Claire to be on his stream. So is Brutus the British, with his like 30, few hundred people that follow him and tens of people that watch him, is he going to open up his own political party from scratch, or is he going to work with the existing ones that are somewhat similar to his vision? And then when you work with the existing ones that are somewhat similar to your vision, are you going to accept their allies? So allies along the way, that they made allyship with Claire Caw. And you're saying, like, I don't want to be allies with Claire Caw. We say, well, what do you want to do? You want to start from scratch, or you want to work together with the people that they've been working together with?
Well, I think that's kind of the point, is people don't think there's a political solution. They think that the political system essentially is the problem.
But saying you're just a dissident, a random singleton dissident.
I'm not the one saying this, Doovid. This is just what people in general are saying more and more these days. I don't know what to say to these people, because it would appear that no matter what anyone does politically, there's no way to stem the tide of this.
Well, stem the tide of, if you use, just random pronouns, saying, okay, stem the tide of the negative things that are happening to society. But if you like the Luke Ford, who will tie that to demographic change and immigration. And so you were saying, like, I don't mind demographic change or immigration. It's not my issue. But for a lot of these people, the Luke Ford stream or the different ones, they feel like there's a movement, and the movement is against demographic change and immigration. And so that follows protocol in politics. So if you're talking just like science, you want to understand the science of like how things work versus actually affecting change. You want to affect change, you have to create a movement, and creating movements are extremely difficult, even if you could assess the numbers. And I've done these number assessments. Like in the US, if you assess the number of people that are anti-immigration, anti-demographic change, you might have tens of millions. If you assess the number of people that would be white nationalist, you might have hundreds of thousands. If you have like already you're like neo-Nazi leaning, you might be down to tens of thousands of people, and you start like, just going to start from scratch. You're just going to say your ideas and get it out there. And I'm not a movement type guy. I'm an independent scholar. I'm not trying to create a movement. I'm not trying to join a movement like God consciousness, better world for everybody type thing. Like, I'm already a Jew. Like if there's a Jewish movement, I think I'm part of that either way. But I'm not really recruiting people to be part of some Jewish movement or something like that. And I don't know. I think a lot of the people, you want to cover what you did this week and kind of like your relationship with your fellow streamers like Claire and Will to Power, or whoever else you're streaming, because I don't feel I have a relationship with really any of the people I stream with except for people I'm exchanging ideas with, and my relationship with them could be friendly, but it's more the idea. So okay, I have a friendship with you, but it's more the common interest that of quantum consciousness and reincarnation that keeps us together, that we both want to push forward on these ideas.
Sure, yeah, sounds good. Basically, my goal in all this is to increase knowledge, raise awareness, because I see a lot of very destructive patterns in history, and people haven't really learned the lessons from those by and large. And this is just a general criticism. I see it across the board. It doesn't apply to anyone in particular, and I'd like for people to own up to basically the role that they've played in history. And I think that we're in a situation of both sides kind of blaming the other, and that doesn't really help anything. And I guess this idea of a secular government has, I think, been to our detriment as a culture. And so I'm trying to push this narrative that all systems of human governance are computationally equivalent to a theocratic dictatorship. It's just a question of who the theocratic dictators are. And so it helps kind of clear up this, or dispels the myth of a secular government. So that's in the political sphere, that's my main thing. And also defending against falsehoods like the oft quoted Aryan invasion theory. That's just a very toxic and stubborn belief that doesn't seem to want to go away in spite of all the evidence. And the fact that people who defend it don't really have a background in genetic science, yet they're so confident that those genetic scientists are interpreting the data correctly, even though there's been tons of evidence that scientists have been wrong many, many times before, including this evolution thing, which I talked about on a recent stream. And I think we're actually moving closer to a solution for what the exact mechanism of evolution is. So I think that'll be just as revolutionary as the quantum mind hypothesis. And it does play into it, because it's basically explaining how quantum complexity dictates what would appear to be a creationist type model rather than an evolutionary type model, which predicts that the changes will be very gradual rather than stepwise. But stepwise transitions are what we observe. And we've seen a lot of evidence before that there's what they call missing links. And so people have basically tried to fill that gap with God or with various other ad hoc explanations, but without a really cogent model that makes the predictions. I think people will just continue to wonder and continue to fall into these traps where they're not really getting the full picture. It's only part of the picture. So I think it's really positive to have the conversations that will lead us in a direction where it will make the answers sort of more self-evident, because I'm seeing basically on the far, quote, far right and quote, far left, that there's an increase, people are increasingly calling for violence. I don't know if you've noticed this, but it does seem that people are getting more adamant and sort of digging their heels in on both sides and becoming increasing. I don't really think the left was ever open to arguments, but even the people on the right now are becoming increasingly cloistered off and in an echo chamber where violence is just constantly being promoted. And it's violence across the board, like they're making death threats to me all the time, calling me a Jew, saying that they want to do all these horrible things to me. And I think, like, well, if this is inevitable, I don't really want that to happen, obviously, but I've got to kind of do something to protect myself against this, because this is not this is not the direction I want things to go in. So it's been a mixed bag. On the one hand, the intellectual conversations are going in a more fruitful direction with the people who are actually open to learning, and on the other hand, some people are just like, I was having trouble streaming for whatever reason, something wrong with my browser, so I couldn't get a stream going. So Will hosted the stream instead, and that was a pretty interesting conversation for a while. And then OV said, well, why don't you come over and we'll stream on my channel? And I didn't really want to, because I think OV is a bad actor, a liar, and a shill, and basically just, you know, mixed up with people that I don't trust at all, and that have already given me reason not to trust them. And I never will trust them on that basis. But I went over just because I don't want to shy away from a debate. And I think maybe this is a flaw for me that is manifested in several occasions. Like I kept talking to Claire probably longer than I should have, because it was a waste of time, because the point of having a debate with someone is to potentially change their mind, but clearly she's not open to changing her mind. And it was a bit the same with these people. It was just an interrogation about my past and try to discredit me. And when they realized that they couldn't discredit me, they just started to call me just absolutely horrible names, and saying that I had had sex with Black people, just stuff that I don't know. I don't know why anybody would say that. It just makes me think, well, that's really sad. They must have an absolutely terrible family life, and no one's ever really loved them. If they're willing to speak to someone who's coming to them in good faith, if they're willing to speak to someone like that, there's just no chance of having any type of collaboration.
People consider you an opponent, and they'll do whatever it takes to defeat you. And kind of the concept of blood sports, where if you participate in these blood sports and you appear to be on the wrong side of people, that you know, just whatever it takes to defeat you. And it's kind of like Halsey, where you know, we're talking like Cobra Kai versus Miyagi-Do, and I'm kind of more a Miyagi guy, and he's kind of more Cobra Kai, and just like, God forbid, like gouge the guy's eyes out. And you look at a guy like Norvin or something that, you know, maybe was able to garner fame by taking down frame games or something like that, or you know, attacking me or attacking different people. And that, you know, so it should make sense. Like, yeah, there are going to be people who are going to attack you. There are going to be people who are going to fight dirty, because if they could score a victory, even in an underhanded way, that in some way that could benefit them. And that's why it, you know, pays to not have that negative energy, to just say, I don't want to sink down to this level. Even like, you know, I was saying like James or something, like, I don't want to get in a teasing match with James. You know, like, or you know, this, like, that's not who I am. That's not what I want to get involved with. And if you see yourself getting dragged down like that, isn't that just karma? You know, it's action reaction, where you say like, no, it wasn't funny teasing that person. It wasn't funny beating that person down and making them embarrassed and look like a fool. And that just causes the karma that someone else is going to think that's funny when it happens to you.
I guess, yeah, I mean, karma is a complicated thing. And I guess the way I see it is, anybody who opposes me they're going to have terrible consequences. And I think there's a lot of evidence to support that. So that's more talking about their karma. I think my karma is that I'm a teacher and a patient person, but I don't really tolerate people who are antagonistic to my goals, and I'll neutralize them. So I don't really think me getting attacked online is necessarily a sign that I have bad karma. It's more a sign that bad actors are magnetically drawn to me, and they try to defeat me, but they can't. And in the process end up destroying themselves. I mean, how much more evidence do people need before they stop this fruitless path? They don't seem to want to learn. They seem to want to believe that karma doesn't exist.
Yeah, I mean, I think you mentioned it yourself when you're like, people don't largely act based off of evidence.
Yeah, it's a real shame. It just sort of makes you think there's, not just no political solution, but no solution at all. And that just makes me think that people, they don't actually want anything to change. They just want to complain and spread their toxicity everywhere and persecute anyone who doesn't go along with their stupid narratives. And like they're basically, I guess in a lot of ways I'm trying to get people to take responsibility for the shitstorms that they create. They have a choice, but they're not making the choice. They're not going in the direction that makes sense. They're not acquiring knowledge. They're just saying, well, I already know everything and I don't need to learn anything.
Well, I think
I already have the solution. I just have to kill everyone. Well, I don't really think that history, if it's taught us anything, it's that if you kill a bunch of people, that doesn't really solve your problems. It just makes more problems happen down the line.
Well, we seem to have pretty much summed up this mechanism over the last few weeks to say where the mechanism is obvious from a consciousness point of view of dissonance, where people have their higher level patterns and then they have their sense perception, and then there's a dissonance created and they enter fight or flight. And fight or flight, where we're saying whatever patterns that they're working with. So if their patterns, let's say, it's racism or whatever their pattern that they have in their head that they think is the higher level pattern, like, oh, they've, like Luke will say, the key to unlocking all the secrets. And then more information comes where they see their pattern isn't really working and they enter dissonance. So they either have to reevaluate their belief systems and create new rules to operate by, which could be excruciatingly painful and difficult, just like multiculturalism and diversity could be very difficult because you have to learn about all these different ways of life and, be very respectful and tolerant and patient, such to the point where I'm postulating this multiple truth hypothesis. Or you have to keep on trying to force your paradigm for how you think you understand the rules. And, just like, I'm right, I'm going to win in the end because I'm right. And then you're more likely to enter fight than flight. And that's, why violence is logical, where the person, just said, there's this way of looking at the world and there's that way of looking at the world. And whether I'm right or wrong, this is the side I'm on due to, circumstances, like this is my identity, this is my race, this is my nation. So even if I'm wrong, I'm going to have to fight on this side either way. So let's just fight. And so, I think we pretty conclusively went through the mechanism that it should make sense why this is happening.
Great. I'm glad that you took the time to re-explain that, and I hope that people who are still going down this path realize that they don't have truth on their side. They're just twisting the facts to suit their narrative. And so they really have no claim to the moral high ground. And when things blow up in their face down the line, as they invariably will, because if you fail to learn the lessons of truth, logic, and morality, Mother Nature will eventually correct you. You won't listen to people telling you the truth and you dismiss them. Well, you're going to learn the lesson one way or the other. It was so funny because last night I did a stream because I wanted to learn more about.
Did you want to cover your whole week? I don't think you did. And I thought.
Sure.
Did you do a stream like Monday on your channel and take it down? Was there some reason that happened? I don't know if you want to just cover, just to keep the week in review. And I've been wanting to get more people. We had people join the last few weeks, but they didn't really seem interested in, just like, okay, you opened up your stream and it was a Babcast and they popped on and started carrying on conversations or interviews. But I don't think too many people were really into the week in review concept of, just retrospect self-improvement.
Yeah, I took that stream down because there were what I felt to be, calls to violence, and I don't want to be associated with that. Because at the end of the day, as you said, violence is inevitable. So why spend all this time talking about it and thinking about it? Because, really, it's barbaric. Violence happens, right? So why focus on it? Why not focus on the thing that doesn't happen spontaneously, which is the acquisition of knowledge? And really, these people are delusional if they think that, let's say they get everything they want, okay? And they have their magical ethno state. that is not going to solve all of their problems. And it would be extremely stupid to think that it would. And so if they're unwilling to understand what it takes to run a society, how are they ever going to garner faith from people who need to support them for their mission to work, which it's, doubtful that it even could work in the first place. But the fact that they're not even willing to focus on anything other than violence, and they can't help their emotions and get sucked into this, idiotic sort of violence LARP. Well, I'm not going to put that on my channel. It's not the direction I want to go in. The direction I want to go in is more knowledge and learning from the past so that the same mistakes don't get repeated. And one of the big mistakes is thinking that violence can solve anything. I mean, it barely solves really anything at the end of the day. It is a very limited range of things that violence can solve. So if you don't have a good framework for how society's supposed to operate, and everything is just going to be, well, if you're not saying what we want you to say, we're going to kill you. Okay, well, that's not going to create the kind of society that anybody wants to live in, because everyone's just going to be in a perpetual state of terror about saying the wrong thing. So that's why I took that stream down. I don't want to be associated with calls to violence. Like, on the one hand, I want to talk to people who have the potential to be good leaders, etc. But at the same time, they need to get their emotions under control and stop with the calls to violence, because, we don't need to fuel that fire. That's already happening. People are already being moved towards this. If we start endorsing it, it just drags us down to their level. So really, it's counterproductive in a lot of ways. So I'm very disappointed that a lot of people are going in this direction of just hatred and refusing to look inward at the possible mechanism for them maybe taking some responsibility in what's actually happened, because we all have played a role in the circumstance that surrounds us right now. So there was that, and I kind of decided this week that I don't want to stream with Claire anymore. The main reason is because she did a stream where she was just basically insulting me the whole time and making false allegations about me and then denying it. And I'm just tired of playing the game of just going back and forth and me saying, stop misrepresenting what I'm saying. Her saying, well, how have I misrepresented what you're saying? And then me literally repeating what she just said. And then her saying, well, that is the same thing. You're a biological determinist, even though I've made it very clear numerous times that I'm not. And so this inability to see any type of nuance just sort of goes to show you, I think, how simplistic her worldview is and how unrealistic and just downright stupid it is to think that this type of ideology could ever gain traction. I mean, can you really deny that these Muslim organizations in Europe are led by Jews?
Well, yeah, I think you could deny them. They just interfaith their team like Coalition of Minorities. And I don't think any of those Muslim organizations are led by Jews. And I've demonstrated that from my YouTube channel, because I go to my local mosque and saying, like, none of the local mosques are led by Jews, although they're all part of interfaith coalitions of minorities, and generally those are led by Jews. But we don't lead their mosque or their organizations. So you have CARE. You have the Michigan Council, of Islamicists, and when they team up, generally the Jewish organizations have more power than them. But certainly we're not running their organizations. We're just a more powerful member of the coalition.
Well, I think it's pretty clear that it's Jewish intellectuals and political activists that want there to be massive Muslim immigration into Europe, just like it was back before the Crusades. And I don't know how people can deny this.
Yeah, I would reject that. I'm saying that Jews are generally on the side of immigration or Muslim immigration, and there's animosity between Europeans and Jew, going back long periods of times, from the Crusades to the destruction of the temple in the Holocaust, where obviously there's a lot of bad blood between Europeans and Jews, although immigration is a natural phenomenon. It's not like migrations of people is a natural phenomenon. Even if the Jews act as a catalyst to speed it along or use our power that we've accumulated over hundreds of years of being in Europe to speed the process, that we're not causing the process. The process would be there even without the Jews. And that should be obvious in saying that Muslims in Europe have been just borders are natural phenomenon. And you could look at this from a purely biological perspective of like if the humans were just an animal species of one ecosystem and one group trying to move into the ecosystem of another group, that is completely natural. You don't need a catalyst of a different subspecies or group of species trying to catalyze one group moving from another. That happens naturally.
Okay.
You can see the Jewish role is, the Jewish role in it is obvious. Like, you just look at organizations and lawsuits and big names, but the pressures of migration are also obvious. Like, obviously, there's 1.5 billion Muslims, and they're going to want to spread out and take more territory. Even if the Jews are catalyzing that, they're not the cause of it.
It just seems like you're playing a game of semantics. And I think people are not going to believe this semantic game. They're going to say, well, there's a bunch of Muslims in Europe. What caused it? They're going to look at history, say, oh, there was a bunch of Muslims in Europe before the Crusades, before they were all kicked out. Jews were behind that. And now Jews are behind it this time. And I don't really see how what you've said disproves that position. It just kind of seems like you're playing a word game and saying, well, they catalyzed it, they accelerated it, but they're not the cause of it. Well,
yeah, I think that should be pretty clear. Saying the cause of migration is natural. The cause of migration is just a natural inclination to spread out and control more territory. And you could have allies, you could have the Jews that play a role in that, but Jews are not causing Muslims to come to Europe. Jews might be helping Muslims come to Europe, but there's been a natural push of even Muslims obviously is a religion, not a race. And you look like Bosnians and the European Muslims and like Chechnya or something like that. But I mean, just look at a map of the spread of Islam, and that you didn't need the Jews to help Islam spread. Islam, like the white man, you're going to say on the flip side, are you going to give the Jew the credit for the empires created that like obviously the white man had no desire to conquer India or South Africa or parts of Africa in the New World. It was just the Jews that brought the white man to India and to North America. I
am actually going to say that with the help of their Christian religion.
So, but you would say that if it weren't for Jews, the Europeans would have never left Europe.
That is what I'm saying, yes. I mean, it's pretty clear that it was all financed by Jews, all the European imperialism, and the fact that it was done in the name of Christianity, which is a Jewish religion. Yeah, I am going to say that was a Jew-led affair. And, well, maybe you can say, oh, they were just a catalyst and accelerationist, and Europeans would have done it anyway, but I don't see the evidence that the Europeans were particularly interested in empire. They were happy to sort of have intertribal warfare and just remain in continental Europe until the advent of Christendom.
Well, one, you could argue that historically were migrations, before the advent of the Jewish people even, where historically that, so I mean, I would probably accept your thing, like, yes, it is us, it is the Jews, but it's because it was ordained by God. It's not that, the Jews acting as an agent. It's God who's doing it, and God is doing it through the Jewish people. So if you reject the biblical narrative that God acts through the Jewish people, and so you're just thinking like, no, I mean, it's not God doing it through the Jewish people. It's just the Jewish people doing it. I mean, I don't know if that's what you're saying, but I mean, that's the logical proof of Christianity or Islam, that why is the Bible true? And, so then you have to explain the dominant role of the tribe of the Jewish people, besides for the biblical explanation that God acts through the Jewish people.
I'm a bit confused. On the one hand, you're saying there's a religious argument and God chose the Jews to carry out this mission of destroying all the world's sovereign nations. And at the same time, you're saying, well, it's just something that happens naturally and people want to immigrate to different places. Is it both of those things, or?
Well, I mean, multiple hypotheses. So if you take an evolutionary, scientific, so to say, view of the human animal acting, or if you take a biblical understanding of how God created the world. And so one thing you would have to say that, no, I mean, you're incorrect. There was no such thing as the nation state. The Jew did not destroy the nation state. The nation state never existed till the last few hundred years. And, historically, we all descend from one person. And I mean, so you put a lot of suppositions in there that are probably unprovable or false to put, to say, what's the origin of the nation state? Is there a natural order of the nation state that had to be destroyed, or was there always warring tribes? Were there always moving borders and questionable borders and migrations happening? That so if you want to take the biblical narrative where you say the world is only 5,778 years old in the flood of Noah, or if you're taking a more scientific evolutionary where the origin of man goes back tens of thousands or even millions of years, and the Jewish tribe only enters 4,000 years ago, and you look at the Vedas. There's no Jews in the Vedas, and the Vedas are supposedly occurring well before the advent of the Jewish people, and you have the exact same issues of borders and tribes incurring upon other territory, and you don't need Jewish middlemen to cause look at like the Bhagavad and the Yadu dynasty and the Pandavas or whoever are fighting in that. You don't need any Jews for that.
Yeah, that's true. There were nation states before the Jews existed.
And there were borders and migration issues and people conquering territory and all of these issues. They're universals of humankind. The Jews definitely play a role, and especially the last 1,000 years, possibly going back, 3,000-4,000 years, if you just didn't accept the Bible. But so if you accept that the Jews have played some catalyzing role, that probably Leif Erikson or whatever, the Norse people who came to North America likely did that without the Jews. But the Jews come along, and through banking and the private equity and the joint stock company catalyze huge amounts of Europeans moving across the world. But Europeans were already moving across the world before the Jews invented the joint stock company to help catalyze the moving of mass amounts of them.
Okay. Yeah, I'm not going to deny that. I mean, clearly my position is that Europeans descend from Indians, and so they're not actually native to Europe. They left India and they colonized Europe and possibly much larger swaths of the world. So I'm not basically saying that there's anything inherently bad about people moving around, and that's sort of something people need to understand, is that this is the human history.
I did this just after my debate with JF. The next day I made this video, Multiculturalism, Response to JF Debate, or overview of the evidence. I wanted for 3 hours, and I brought 20 different studies, multiple PowerPoints of evidence that multiculturalism, diversity is a good thing for society. I mean, obviously there's some problems with it, but substantial evidence that diversity benefits society. And no one really responded to any of this. This is generally accepted practice in university. That's why most corporations and universities and government function according to these principles, because the scientific consensus generally supports that. And if you want to take like evidence-based approach to these issues, so we can't agree about the origin of humankind. So I'm going to say it's the Bible. The world is exactly 5,778 years old, and the God who created the world in fact chose the Jewish people and uses the Jewish people to manifest the destiny of the world. And there might be bad qualities, but basically it's benefiting you. It's not destroying you. And, you could be like, that's nonsense. You don't believe that that's the case. The world's certainly not only 5,778 years old, nor do you think that, God is choosing and acting through the Jewish people. But in fact, the origin of the world is older, and the origin of people, doesn't come from Babel and Tower of Babel in the Middle East. It comes from India, or so on and so on. And, that's why I have my multiple truth hypothesis. So, I mean, I could come and listen to your understanding of the origins of the world and humanity and races and tribes where, do you really have a coherent worldview system where you have a coherent worldview where it's like, yes, like mankind originated here and spread, and the changes that one tribe, led to the other and phenotypically changed or culturally changed. Do you have a coherent worldview?
Yeah, I take a multiple origins hypothesis. My position is that Arabs, Jews, and blacks all originated in Africa, and the rest originated in India. And there's been various migrations throughout human history that goes back probably in the hundreds of thousands of years.
In some sort of cold winter theory, that as people move north or into colder climates, their skin got light, they phenotypically became lighter.
There's more than one cause for skin lightening, but yeah, the main cause for skin lightening is when you just get less sun. So that could happen in a warmer climate if, let's say, one class of people, the slave owner class was outside of inside, not out in the sun working the fields, that there would not be as much necessity for them to generate melanin. And also there's the position that because they went farther north, there was that other pressure to lose melanin. That's where you get the blue eyes, the light skin. Then that's why this phenomenon manifests in various populations. And you could see the phenotypic similarities between Africans and Chinese. And I would basically take the position that some of those groups did originate from Africa. They just left Africa earlier than the Jews did. And it appears the Jews didn't really leave Africa until maybe the origin of their foundational myth, which is this like Babylon story and all that stuff. So yeah.
And your own ancestors were largely...
But there's also another thing that fuels lightening of skin, which is inbreeding. If a population decides that they prize lighter skin, they would do
sexual selection.
It's sexual and it's sociological, because when a culture prizes lighter skin, they will tend to do selective breeding because of that social pressure. So they'll this guy has the lightest skin of the whole group and this girl has the lightest skin. Let's just put them together so their kids will have lighter skin. So it's a form of inbreeding.
I mean, all things equal, that a person would choose the blue-eyed girl over you. That if there was an example, like if you had a sister that had all your qualities except blue eyes and lighter hair, that the average male would sexually select for the lighter featured woman over you.
That goes down to R and K selection. R selected people tend to go more for like large breasts, large asses, and things like that. The K selection is more focused on the intellectual traits. So something like light eyes, I can see that being basically if you're spending enough time in the northern climates, some people will start to get lighter eyes. People will favor that because we have this predisposition towards favoring contrast. And that's a beautiful contrast. So I don't know if...
Like a bird or something. I'm saying there's just like... I'm forgetting the name of like the peacock or something like that, where just animals have got exotic things, and it was explained for sexual selection. The origins of lighter hair is a sexual selection type thing, and men or women might not know why they have a certain type of attraction, but just an exotic color creates a larger sexual attraction. That's a generic evolutionary understanding of. I think that's probably the dominant evolutionary explanation for that.
Yeah, I think it's a combination of things, but the mechanism you describe is something that does operate quite a bit. And you can kind of see how, like if you imagine one of these more primitive European populations where the phenomenon of blue eyes started to manifest. And those people would say, oh, those people are so much more beautiful. So that then there would have been a sociological pressure for them to generate more children. And over time, the number of brown-eyed people would decrease. And eventually it would just be like, oh, well, you're not one of us. You don't have blue eyes type of thing, because that, you know, that's how people are. They're tribal. And so you can see how something like blue eyes would eventually come to dominate in a population when there was a pressure from the environment for that quality to manifest. So that's basically my narrative on how things happen. I think it explains a lot more. And
but also the warring factions. So your whole point about Jews and immigration would somewhat be mute. So if you have the origins of people from India going up north when there have been no people there, and they become lighter featured, they sexually select until you have basically all the people of that region being the same, but the path of migration that led the first people there will eventually lead the future people there. So the people that first went there and then they became lighter featured, and the next waves of people that went there, obviously there's going to be continuous waves of people going there. And so, the differentiate, if you're going to look at like an evolutionary type basically you're postulating some form of evolution where the population traveled and it diverged, and then new populations came. And of course, there's a conflict. There's either breeding conflict or predator-prey models. And what doesn't that have to do with like Arabs constantly coming, just like the Indian people went up north. The Arab peoples also have been constantly trying to go up north, but the Indian people differentiated into these lighter skinned people. And just saying, why wouldn't have the Arab peoples that have went up north have differentiated into these lighter featured people? And what about the Jews? Because obviously Jews are relatively pretty light features. Like, statistically 20% of Jews have blue eyes, 5% of Jews have blonde hair.
yeah, you can argue that that's because of interbreeding with Europeans. And this does appear to be part of the...
You're saying the process that caused Indian people to become European isn't the same process that caused Jewish people to become European. That came from interbreeding.
That's correct. It would have taken a lot longer for the Indians to turn into the Europeans. I mean, obviously they're quite different, and they didn't practice what you call miscegenation, or like they didn't breed outside of their group, whereas it's been a Jewish strategy to mix for as long as they've existed. And so, yeah, it doesn't appear that the African originating people have that genetic potential to get blue eyes on their own. And we can see this with the Asian groups. Like, I don't think anybody who's Japanese or Chinese has blue eyes unless there's a mixture of them with an Indo-Aryan population.
Or albino.
Right, but that's a completely different mechanism. That's just like a random mutation. And that can happen in any group. I mean, you get...
But here in America, you have a lot of African Americans with blue eyes. Not like a lot, but I mean, percentage-wise, maybe like 1 out of 1,000. And it's a recessive genetic trait, according to biology, that if you had... I don't know how many African Americans you deal with, but I would say I know at least 10 blue-eyed African Americans, and I don't know their genetics, if they have, recessive, if they have, they could have 2 different white ancestors that would allow them to have blue eyes, so they could be completely African and have, like if President Obama's mother had blue eyes, and even though he married a darker skinned woman, and even if Melania or his daughter's daughter all married fellow African Americans, and then they married another blue-eyed man that conceivably is so in America that it's not too rare. I mean, like on TV, there's a lot of famous personalities. I forget that video game that's popular in they made a video game about Detroit, but on popular TV, there's lots of popular African Americans with blue eyes that are in popular media culture.
Yeah, most African Americans are mixed race, by and large. They have some European blood.
That it's a question of the racial science. So if you take the racial science, the most science will show race is somewhat irrelevant. If you take a blue-eyed man and raise him in China, he's going to naturally speak Chinese and acclimate to Chinese culture. Maybe some of the dietary stuff will be slightly more difficult for himself, but people who are brought up in England, like Claire, she speaks English with an English accent, and most of the evidence would show that culture is not genetic, it's learned, and speciation. Obviously mixed heritage will, you have dominant and recessive traits, and the science is pretty conclusive. And I think that in terms of that, a lot of the science has basically been discovered. There's not much left to move on it.
Or science has become politicized and in the process discredited itself. But we were talking about this phenomenon of blue eyes, and I think it's important to understand that if these populations, if these out of Africa populations had remained endogamous, the blue-eyed trait never would have evolved, because it just doesn't appear to be possible. So they rely on mixing with blue-eyed populations to get the blue-eyed variation, whereas it happens spontaneously. And you can see this in India. There's people born all the time with hazel eyes, green eyes, and even blue eyes. And so it does appear that there are essentially 2 and arguably 3 different human populations.
Yeah, I'm saying obviously the concept that the Europeans came from India is old. Like Himmler had his envoys sent to the Himalayas, and the Nazis had a lot of research, and that goes back earlier. Evolution today, most scientists believe in the common origin of all people descending from one common ancestor, human ancestor, although there's multiple theories, and of the multiple origin, your concept that the European descends from India is disputed. And certainly among white nationalists, there's more dispute in that would say that there's a divergence. No, that the original founder of Europeans wasn't an Indian; it was a blue-eyed person, like I forget the mummy that came, the dark-skinned mummy with blue eyes that was discovered recently. That was in all the news, like that. But how we got into this divergent topic, because it's related to worldview. The origin of humanity, the origin of why people are different, of different nations. So you want to say, like, not today, like the nation state, because the nation state is relatively a modern invention, but of nations and tribes and just people looking different. There's no consensus on the origin of that. And
it's because science is politicized. And I guess the people who are running things don't really realize that they can't change the facts about the historical record. All they can do is either maintain credibility or destroy their own credibility. So as far as I'm concerned, that mainstream science is just as discredited as these Aryan Kang LARPers, because that's just not what the evidence suggests. And then you get these insane theories about people who are spontaneously getting green eyes, even though both of their parents have brown eyes in India. And the justification for that is, oh, well, it's just something residual in the genetic code from this mystical Aryan invasion. And what I'm trying to tell people is that this is absolutely ridiculous assertion. It's anti-scientific. And if people want to be guided by, mysticism, a mystery cult, theological posits with no interest in whether these things are objectively true or not, well, then they're not going to get credibility in the eyes of the majority, because they can't back up their assertions with science. So if that doesn't matter to people, well, fine, but there may be consequences for taking an essentially non-scientific view and a more religious-centered view on assessing the historical record.
Well, of course, obviously. It's saying, so most of the modern world, in fact, goes with the Bible and the chosen status of the Jewish people. I'm saying that's the consensus largely of the modern world. And there is, the evolution, even though there's a consensus of evolution, there's also consensus around the Bible, and they're conflicting. And, like you had that stream the other day where you're talking about the dinosaurs and humans. According to the Vedas, mankind has been around for millions of years. The Vedic understanding of old created world that man was created towards the beginning of creation and existed for hundreds of millions of years. So what place does science have in answering these questions? What place does religion have in answering these questions? And can you merge similar ideas? So if you say, I'm going to go with the Bible, and saying when you reject the path of your parents, so you say you think that generations upon generations of your ancestors were just simply tricked and fooled into
I think
Christianity.
they were actively persecuted and murdered in large numbers until finally they had no choice but to submit to this foreign religious dogma. And now that's basically ruined their psychology, and they despise themselves, they despise their heritage, and they want to die because they don't want to keep living in a world where they're persecuted ideologically and told that there's something inherently wrong with them. And that's why you're seeing so many people willing to just lie down and die. But reincarnation is unfalsifiable, so dying is not going to work. And that's kind of one of my main narratives that I'm pushing.
Yeah, so if you can't realistically know the origins of your ancestor, if you say you come from Northern Europe and you don't really know the pre-Northern European origins of your people, maybe it's the common origin of all humanity, or maybe there were tribes that left from India, but you know that your ancestors were conquered by the cross, largely from Rome, and the Rome that conquered your ancestors was a Rome that bare the cross. And however that happened, looking back, whether your ancestors willingly accepted the cross or whether they only accepted the cross in order to survive, and if they hadn't accepted the cross, they would have perished, and hence you wouldn't be alive today. But you're looking back and you're saying that for over 1,500 years, your ancestors basically lived a lie.
Basically, yes. I mean, you said
and you
so
don't even know
yourself.
about before that.
You said so yourself. If someone promoted reincarnation in Europe in those days, they would be killed. There's a reason for that. It was to establish the hegemony of this foreign political cult.
Yeah, but one thing you say, if you believe in spiritual forces, that there was some dominant spiritual force that permeated, that there was something unstoppable. You were saying, well, how come your ancestors were defeated? And obviously because it was a superior force that they were up against. And saying, so what gave power to that superior force to defeat your ancestors?
Ruthlessness and money, as well as the spiritual degeneracy of our leadership. They didn't hold themselves to the proper standard and essentially forgot their heritage, and therefore were willing to embrace ideologies for essentially political reasons.
Yeah, I don't know if any evidence would support your stipulation that the people who defeated your ancestor defeated them because they were more ruthless. I'm saying likely it was because of superior organization and technology. Whether they were more ruthless, maybe your ancestors were more ruthless, and the Romans were actually less ruthless than your ancestors. It was just superior organization and technology.
That's possible, sure, but
the evidence would largely.
My ancestors don't have a history of committing genocide upon the priest class of other tribes.
Well, how do you know that?
I know that because I know my own history, and this, your religion, they target the priest class first. So it's basically they cut off the head so that they can become the new head.
There's a lot of unknowns in these fields. So if you're saying you're talking about Northern European, Germanic, Irish tribes that we have some record, but saying obviously there were wars and battles between the different tribes in Northern Europe amongst themselves for probably time immemorial. And saying that whether you have some sort of utopian past where you believe in ancient times your ancestors lived in some sort of utopian society, that's unlikely based on fact. I mean, it's likely that war and genocide and conquering and migrations has been the reality of the world from the origins of humanity.
Like I said, the Veda outlines specific rules about warfare. And in those rules, you're not supposed to touch the priest class of opposing tribes. So I have no
But the
reason.
Vedas also clearly outlines that people didn't follow the rules.
Yeah, and that's a big reason why they lost.
I mean, in theory, if you wanted to say, if you knew every incarnation, let's say incarnation of your bloodline. So if the origin of your transmigration of your soul doesn't match the transmigration of your genetics, or if there's partial, and I mean, these things we discussed on our stream that are, hopefully we'll have time to move further into, like, like transmigration of souls. Was there a certain genetic component of your soul where a component of your soul goes back, into Ireland thousands and thousands of years ago? Do you have multiple components of your soul, or did your soul transmigrate where possibly your current soul has absolutely no connection to the genetic point of your biology going back thousands of years ago? And let's say that your origin of your soul followed generically your genetic pattern, or if there's multiple components that make up your soul, at least a portion of your soul that followed your genetic pattern, and that you could have a memory of what was going on in each generation of the hundreds of generations going back. And presumably there was warfare and genocide and migrations and tribal war in almost every single generation that your soul incarnated.
Yeah, but the nature of these wars was different, and there were noble wars and there were ignoble wars. And so it's important to make that distinction. Now, as regards to
what empowered, so you're saying there was an ignoble, there was what do you call it, ignoble?
Yes.
Is that when it's ignoble? I don't know if that's the word. An ignoble war, that what force empowered the ignoble side to victory? If you're saying that the Roman or the cross was ignoble, what power gave that the ability to have victory over your at least genetic ancestors?
Well, like I said, ruthlessness and collective, they were working as a collective. And
you don't have any evidence of the ruthlessness part, or are you saying you do have evidence? Are you saying that the Romans were known for their ruthlessness?
Well, yeah, like I said, they targeted the priest class first, which would be considered ignoble by traditional standards, but they understood that the population took their cues from the priest class, so all they had to do was carry out a genocide against the priest class, who was relatively defenseless, and therefore they were able to take power and to basically take control of the army, and then from there use their religions to propagandize the populace, who then became convinced that it was in their interest to spread this Christian religion, which led to more ignoble wars, more death, more loss of knowledge, which has led us to the situation that we're in today. But
you have almost no idea what this priest class looked like before that happened.
Yes, because evidence of it was destroyed in the interest of instituting this more recent political cult. I mean, this is how their power works. They're like trying to erase the pre-Judaic.
Let's just say you don't know the origin of your soul every generation. What's to say that that wasn't you who did that? That in the generation, like, do you remember who you were that generation? How do you know that it wasn't you who did that? That you weren't the ignoble Roman bearing the cross that defeated your genetic ancestor?
Because reincarnation just doesn't work like that. I've been priestly.
How do you know? I'm saying you don't know every single incarnation from. I mean, whatever the beginning of humanity, where you think your soul first incarnated, where you say, was your soul constantly in the world every generation till today?
Yes, everyone's has been. It's just that most people have been animals.
Well, it's a debate among incarnation, but if you say that since your soul entered the earth, that it's been in this earth, among the earth, possibly in the animal kingdom or human kingdom, and so you could possibly believe that there are spiritual worlds where your soul took a break for a while, was incarnated a few generations, and then for like 1,000 years returned to the spirit world before incarnating again, just for the different schools of incarnation. But you believe that that's not the case, that the soul is in the material world every generation.
No, I don't believe it's in the material world every generation. I wasn't born for 100 years since the last time that I was killed for political reasons.
And where was your soul since then? You're saying it was in the spirit realm.
Yeah.
It wasn't in the animal. It was in Gorloka or something. You say it went to some non-material spiritual realm where it rested till it took birth again.
Yeah, that's what happened. I mean, and you're asking about whether I would have been part of this Roman conquest thing. I mean, I've been the way that I am, i.e. priestly, for several incarnations. I wouldn't be able to do what I'm doing now if I wasn't already a master of priestly attributes. I mean, that's the way we see it, is that you're in the animal form for many incarnations. Eventually you become a lowly human, and over many more incarnations you proceed up the Varna system from servant to merchant to warrior to priest, and then you remain in priest, or you become enlightened and stop taking birth. That's how we see it.
Yeah, but could you priest transfer over where one incarnation you were bearing the cross, you were a priest of the cross?
No, that would never have happened because I already have my religion and I've never converted to Christianity. It doesn't work like that. So the people who converted to Christianity, by and large, are still, in a lot of ways, not Christians, right? They're still carrying out pagan traditions. They still believe in many things that could be considered idolatrous by Noah Hyde standards, as Claire would say. So arguably, even the people that were defeated by the cross weren't wholly defeated by it. It's just a political cult, basically, that they're hypnotized by. But I was never in that political cult. My spiritual ancestry is India, and the fact that I can take birth as a European is not indicative of what is normally able to be done. Normally, people incarnate very closely along their own genetic lines. But the fact that people have mixed race offspring, obviously the souls that inhabit those bodies aren't coming from nowhere. So it is obviously possible to have some degree of change that's happening in your race, but it's extremely limited.
Did you ever program with AutoCAD?
No, I haven't used that, but I do know several people that use it at their job.
Are you familiar with the concept? I mean, we have a purpose to asking you this, but are you familiar with the concept of layering?
Yeah. I've used Adobe Photoshop, and there's layers in that.
Yeah, so where you have, so as, let's say, like a microchip or something like that, where you have maybe 10 layers within the same layer, and the different layers would have different points, or from, I don't know, in the chat, I guess No Apologies came on, he was trolling me, and Claire's here, Penelope's generally friendly, or Cult Bearer, but I did blueprint civil engineering, and so the same print, that one print, or anatomy could be an example. Let's do anatomy, where you have your cardiovascular system, your heart and your blood, and then you have your lymph nodes, or your immune system, and you have your nervous system. And I don't have to pull it out, but I assume you know what I'm talking about. But if you looked at I think the 7 major systems of the human body, and you could have a skeletal system, the bones and the sphenoids and the vesicles, and they all in reality come together to make the single life form. So for AutoCAD, if you're designing something, you usually pull out different layers, and then you combine them all together for your function. So I want to layer our kind of understanding of history, where we have our geological, let's say, layer of the origins of the physical material world. You might have a layer for animal, vegetative life, bacterial, just say life in general, non-human life, although all, like these things could be devised into multiple layers. Beside that, you have the layer of the genetic origins of humanity, kind of like, where did humankind first appear, who procreated with who, where they moved to, and where those actual physical procreation between man, women, and offspring go from generation to generation of the origin of humanity. And then you have a spiritual layer where you're talking about the soul within a person, and putting all these things together. So you're looking at multiple layers of the origin of humanity in general, and then the origin of the given you, the Doooovid, the Jennifer, Claire, Penelope, Claire, whoever's participating in this thought experiment, where you're saying, okay, this is my current physical body, and there's the genetic layer of the origins of this flesh that goes through all of my ancestors in a family tree, and then there's the origin of my soul, where my soul was each generation. And as said, that could have been the different understandings of how reincarnation processes, and whether I mean, are you following what I'm trying to
Yeah, I'm following what you're saying. So you're taking a physical computer model for the quantum mind, but that's not how it works. The mind is an indivisible unit. And
well,
so
I'm just trying to give the parallel
there are
of
no true layers. It is just one thing that has different harmonics that manifest in different ways. And therefore there are no layers. There's simply one function, which is the personality. And the greater quantum mind, which is that creates the variations within the particular genetic potential that exists within the fetus, and propagates the consciousness in that manner. So we're not just a collection of ingredients thrown together from the past. We're individual entities that take birth along the lines of our descendants.
why I'm saying all of the things are true when you're saying we're not, well, in fact, we are. And for example, I was at the Hare Krishna temple. I went to 2 different temples, and by the afternoon class, the priest was talking about our identity, and factually we're made up of 70% water, but I don't identify as being 70% water. Saying like this, 100 pounds of water. Nice to meet you. I have an identity, Doooovid, or or Jewish, or American, or engineer, or soul identity. But from a factual level, I am 70% water. And so from a factual level, you might be able to trace each one of those water molecules, and from whatever time means, the origins of those water molecules to how they got to me today, or even the water molecules that make me up currently right now are constantly changing, in that the water molecules that are the majority of this form that I'm in right now, in a year from now, might be majority different water molecules. But there is a factual, traceable element to the physical layer of what makes me up, and the origin of the elements and compounds, and that's largely different than the genetic material, the origin of the physical components that make me up. Then there's the origin of the genetic material, where there's a factual element, where I had parents who had parents who had parents, going back to some origin point where either there is no origin, and humans existed perpetually going forever, or there was some origin point where I'm finally going to reach my original ancestor of my genetic component. And then there's the origin of my soul, where my soul originated at some point, and at some point entered into an entity and enlivened that entity, and then after death transferred that entity to another entity. And if however you look at the nature of the soul, if it's indestructible from when was it created, what was its origin, and if it's indestructible from its origin and creation, it's been in existence from then, that you could trace the pattern of where my soul has been from its creation till today.
Yeah, you can trace it, and we all ultimately come from the earth because life precipitates spontaneously on earth. And so this idea
You're saying those
of
are one and the same. I'm looking at those might possibly be three completely different layers that may or may not overlap, where you're saying that no, the physical molecular matter, the genetic origin, and the soul are in essence one and the same, is where I'm leaving open the potential that no, they're completely different, that the molecular trace and the genetic trace and the soul trace might in fact have nothing to do with each other.
well, this idea that you were talking about before with water, you know, us being comprised 70% of water or whatever the statistic is, I mean, that's materially correct, but it doesn't make any predictions about how our souls are going to behave. So these materialistic approaches, even going all the way up to this idea of genetic constructivism, where we're just layers of various codes sandwiched together, this is not how it works. The origin is in the quantum mind, which is a singular potential. The rest is just consequent to that potential deforming the physical world in the service of the propagation of this potential.
Yeah, so I mean, I guess if we're getting to a deeper understanding of these different understandings of consciousness. So if you look at like a Hamerov model, and you know, kind of what we're trying to do with these streams, because obviously I have an interest in consciousness, so I went to look for who's talking about consciousness, and you know, besides having the model of, you know, Penrose Hamerov model, Hamerov has been putting together for many years the yearly conference on consciousness, where he has brought together some of the biggest names in the field, and there's other people doing that too. But you know, Hamerov, who's put a lot of thought into it, and who has brought a lot of people who don't have the same opinions of him on these issues, but he's brought them to a single conference to express their ideas. You know, has these multiple concepts where maybe consciousness exists separate from the physicality, that there's a phenomenon of consciousness that permeates all of reality, and that the physical mechanism of the body harnesses this consciousness, or that consciousness is a product of the physical mechanism of the body. It doesn't exist separate from the body, but it's something created by the body. And I mean, so these are uncertainties. That's why our conversations are interesting to have, because we're working on the current uncertainties of science, that we're trying to solve the most pressing issues towards humanity. And but I think it pays to understand the different possible solutions to this issue, and to really flush out from a singular level, like from me or you, what's my origin, the genetic, the material, and the spiritual origin. And if there is a divergence between Doovidism and entropyism, where according to entropyism they are in fact the same, the material, genetic, and spiritual origin are all one and the same. But according to Doovidism, that I'm some sort of dualist, where I'm saying no, the molecular origin is different from the spiritual origin. And I'm not sure that's, I think over the past few weeks that we've largely concluded that we have these different I don't know, call them opinions or hypotheses about how this is going to unfold.
Yeah, so the correct way to look at it, I think, is that the potential for consciousness is built into non-conscious matter vis-a-vis the measurement limit. And this is the idea that there are 3+1 space-time dimensions per canonical order. And so the fact that the periodic table has 118 elements is because space-time observes, which is a facet of consciousness, it observes the fact that there are only 3+1 dimensions. And that's why there's only four different types of atomic orbitals, S, P, D, F, and nothing else. That's why the periodic table can be rendered into a three-dimensional shape, because space-time is, quote, conscious or aware or proto-conscious or whatever you want to call it, of the fact that there is this measurement limit, i.e. there's only 3+1 dimensions. And the consciousness arises when you get molecules which have an electromagnetic field which is more complex than just the electronic field that surrounds ordinary matter. So every non-living entity has what you could call an electron field, and it's equal to the array of electrons that make up that matter. But when you have a living organism, you have a separate electropotential field, which dictates the arrangement of the material field. So basically you have this blob of quantum potential, which tells physical matter how it's going to organize. And you can see that in how DNA chains get formed. That isn't happening spontaneously. That's happening because a quantum potential is telling those ingredients, those amino acids, how to assemble themselves. And so this idea of a soul or a consciousness, that arises when the biological organism is sufficiently complex as to maintain that level of a field. So you think of it as first being, a single cell, which has a quantum field all around it. The same way a molecule has an electron field all around it, or an atom has an electron field all around it. You have a living cell, which has a quantum field all around it. And then as that cell gets more complex over many generations, the quantum field also gets more complex. It's actually the quantum field that gets more complex first, and then the biological residue follows. And that eventually becomes consciousness. And then eventually that becomes self-consciousness. So you could think of it as the quantum field folding on itself. And therefore, when it folds, it's able to measure itself. So
I think we got sidetracked a few weeks ago when all those people hopped on. Where I was mentioning was it Friess, or the article about the 17 layers of consciousness, and Freeman Dyson saying that even the subatomic particles have consciousness in the form, like, what does consciousness mean? It means it's a will. And so we have to get these complicated definition games where you're saying what is consciousness? Is it a given will, where you look at like a plant or something that doesn't have a brain or a thought pattern, clearly demonstrates some sort of will, or a single cell organism has some sort of will driving it. And when you were saying, like, don't think of the rock as conscious, but what do you mean? And does the rock somewhat have a will to it, in sort of like a driving motive that keeps its structure stable? And without that will, it wouldn't have the structure, and any even subatomic particle, whatever we get down to, that without some will, that the organization wouldn't exist. And when you mentioned the atomic table, obviously there's components, and none of the components of the simplest material is different from any of the others. It's just a different combination of the same particles. And does there have to be a will, so to say, to that? Or if you're just looking at from like a mechanistic perspective, that it's a state that it's in, that maintaining that state is the lowest form of energy, or the most stable level, and unless something happens to it, it's just going to continue to maintain the most stable level, and whatever caused it to be in that state that's in before that is irrelevant to the fact that it operates according to those rules as of. Or are you going to look that like, is there a singular will, or is there one generic will that pervades everything, or is there a singular will between that, besides like a pervasive will, that even every smallest immaterial object has? And what level is consciousness? Is like this will that the subatomic particle has, to call that will. And when it reaches like consciousness, is consciousness the level where you have a single cell organism? Or are you saying that's still like a will type level, where consciousness doesn't happen until you have like Hamarov would say, till you have these microtubules? So you don't have consciousness till you have plants that have nerve cells that could have these microtubules that could at least harness these quantum particles.
Yeah,
And I don't,
it's challenging because when you use a word like will, it's a bit difficult to know exactly what you mean by that, because I think there's essentially two.
I mean, to differentiate between conscious, when you say a subatomic particle has to be conscious to exist, otherwise, how would it exist? And you're saying, well, if you're using that word for consciousness, and then you're using the same word for conscious when you talk about me and you, it makes it confusing. So I'm using the word will, that a subatomic particle doesn't have consciousness, it is like will.
Okay,
Or
so
maybe consciousness is proper, and Hamarov is uncertain about that, is recognizing both possibilities, that maybe consciousness, that the subatomic particle is in fact the same consciousness that we have on the highest level, or if there's some differentiating factor where you want to call it something different, and that crosses over at a higher level from, we'll use the words will for a lesser level of consciousness to a full level of consciousness.
yeah, it's a bit challenging when we get into these definitions, because I guess you could say, I've pulled up the picture of the three-dimensional periodic table. So one way to word or to predict this array would be to say that these space-time events have the will to conform to 3+1 dimensional reality, but it's not really free will, because every single thing that exists has to conform to this 3+1 dimensional measurement limit. And so, in the sense that the periodic table is conscious of the fact that there are only 3 spatial and 1 time-like dimension, and the reason why you get 118 microstates is because space and time are entangled on the micro scale, whereas they're less entangled on the macro scale. You could say that. But the issue with using words like will or consciousness or even proto-consciousness is that it's definitional. So we have to actually make sure we define the words properly. That's why I choose to go with the measurement limit. So basically everything in the universe is subject to the measurement limit. There's only 3+1 dimensions. The periodic table is proof of that. And everything else that manifests is manifesting within this limitation. And consciousness is simply an end consequence of the fact that there is an awareness to some extent that it's not possible to have more than 3 physical dimensions. I'm not sure if that's clear, but that was the point of doing the periodic table, is to kind of show this wave-like fundamental nature of causality, and to show that even though I don't think you can really, not you, but anybody, I don't think people in general are going to believe that the periodic table is conscious, quote unquote, because they have a certain definition that they use for consciousness. So it's the same idea with like rocks being conscious. I mean, obviously we can't establish in any way that people would largely accept that a rock is conscious, but it's conscious in the sense that it's conscious of how many dimensions it sits in. It's not possible for that rock to be 2-dimensional any more than it is for it to be 4-dimensional. It's 3-dimensional, and no more, no less.
Well, that's why I was mentioning, I mean, last week we were touching on this with over the last few weeks, mentioning going from micro to macro and Avogadro's number, in the basic, dealing with infinity, where, for example, the eye has, I think, like hundreds of millions of cones of, how we see vision, where we have these light receptors that take in photons, and there's actually hundreds of millions of them. So we are, receiving hundreds of millions of photons within our eye system, and then the eye, using some sort of Bayesian statistics, the neural network, takes those hundreds of millions of impulses and creates a universal field. So even though, the reality, like when we talk about psychological triggering and dissonance, where you have these overarching rules and then you have your sense input, that I have one clear vision, like you're seeing one picture of Doooovid in the room that I'm in and all my books. And so in my head, I have one clear internal vision of my reality, but that reality is in essence made up of hundreds of millions of photons hitting, the hundreds of millions of receivers that we have in our retina and our eye. And the same thing for consciousness, that, at least according to the Hamarov-Penrose model, where we have, hundreds of millions, maybe trillions of these microtubules across our neural networks, and those harness trillions and trillions of these subatomic particles, and that if you like holographic or some way that this projects some greater form of consciousness, but in reality I have a singular consciousness where there's the I am in a singular moment of Doooovid, the one being who controls the complete totality of me at the moment. But in reality, that's made up of trillions and trillions of these subatomic particles interacting at this time. And so if you're looking at consciousness in the same way that one of these subatomic particles that makes up one of these atoms that makes up the periodic table, that is there in essence no difference between the consciousness of one element and the consciousness of the totality of Doooovid or Church of Entropy, and it's just a question of degree.
Yeah, you could look at it that way, because both the element and our respective consciousness are subject to the measurement limit. So you can actually see the measurement limit manifesting again here in this diagram. You have subjective consciousness, awareness, self-awareness, and pan-self-awareness, which conforms to the 3+1 measurement limit. And the reason why these, millions or billions or however many constituent particles come together to make the quantum potential is that it's important.
As we do this more, we'll become exact. Because I mean, for example, the number.
I just want to make a distinction before you. I just don't want to forget what I was saying. So what it creates is an electromagnetic function, and that function is not. It's one function. It's not a bunch of different particles added together. It's just one function. And this is why the quantum mind hypothesis is different from the physical mind hypothesis, because it's a bunch of different individual particles, but they're all working together to create only one unified consciousness field.
Yeah, and so hopefully as we progress, if we keep on doing this, that will start becoming exact, and like is it trillions or hundreds of millions? And these things are relatively known. Saying just like Avogadro's number, we have an exact number, 6.022 times 10 to the 23rd, that I guess relates to how many atoms of like hydrogen make up a gram or something like that. But the number of cones in an eye and the number of microtubules in a typical human brain, hopefully over we'll continue our research, and we'll start being precise in our language, and because 10 to the 25th is a big number, but there's a difference between 10 to the 8th, 10 to the 12th, 10 that whatever, and presumably as we start understanding these things more, we'll have closer to exact numbers.
Yeah, I just looked it up really quickly on Google there, and it says that it's about 10. There's about 7 times 10 to the 27 atoms in the human body, and that's kind of the same idea as the fact that we're 70% water. It's not really a predictive theory. It doesn't really tell us anything about the nature of our consciousness, because our consciousness is quantum mechanical, and it only arises because all of these individual atoms are working together to create one single form. So we have to kind of go between this enormous biological complexity of uncountably many atoms and this singular potential form that functions as a single quantum. And I think it's important that we make this distinction, because that'll help us move forward in a more meaningful way, because the measurement limit will still apply it'll apply to all these systems. Like this idea of 3+1 is what predicts the fact that the human mind has 11-dimensional energetic structures. And although that would seem to the naive observer to contradict the measurement limit, because it appears that the physical basis of the measurement limit is 4, because there are many different orders of physical magnitude within the universe. There are 42 orders of linear magnitude within the universe. We can then collapse that down to 14 different orders of volumetric magnitude, which is where these electromagnetic functions manifest, because they are also subject to the fact that everything collapses into a 3-dimensional form physically, and therefore we would have a maximum of 14 dimensions of energetic potential, and the human mind appears to fill up 11 of these. So I'm glad you brought this up, because it is a very important thing to distinguish. Because if we take a purely biological approach, I think we'll quickly encounter this issue of having simply too many different particles to really meaningfully discern between them. I don't think anybody can really even imagine how big 7 times 10 to the 27 is. It seems unfathomably large.
Well, yeah, but we could give it a number. So I mean, there's a difference that at least it's a demonstration of having a better idea what we're talking about when we could quantify it. That if you're talking about the actual Hamarov model of the quantum particles that are acting in these microtubules, how many of these quantum particles, how many microtubules are there? How many different cells that contain microtubules are there in the body? How many of these microtubules are there in a given cell? How many quantum particles would interact in them? And for just a feel of the magnitude, and just the concept of the totality, where we talk consciousness in is there a Doovid consciousness that's a singularity, or is in fact the Doovid consciousness in reality just a sum of large amounts of parts? And the to call a singular Doovid is in fact a fallacy. That's just a reduction in state that's not accurate, and there is no singularity Doovid. It's just a large part of a system working together. And when you try to put that into your reincarnation, where you're saying, no, there is a singularity of the consciousness of Doovid, and when the material physical body of Doovid eventually dies, that the collapse of those states will form one singular collapse of Doovid that will re-enter and take birth in a new form. Or that they would just dissipate and go into completely different directions. And as we said earlier, the different classical opinions of reincarnation that regard to partial souls, for example, you're a genetic component of a father and mother. Is the origin of your soul from just one of those two, or is your origin of your soul half and half, where you have that so these are all age-old controversies within people who believed in reincarnation. And then as we understand the quantum mind better, to scientifically investigate it, that lead to clarifications on the classical belief system of reincarnation? Or is it possible, as I'm predicting, that you'll have some sort of multiple truth hypothesis where it's kind of a wave type function where you can't actually know the truth. You could just know a probability function of different things being more likely or not.
Yeah, it's great questions. I think it's really important to look at these things, because these are the questions people have been asking for a really long time, and it would be nice to have more certainty with regards to answering them, because until we can give a cogent answer that makes predictions, people will just keep asking the questions. And unfortunately, a lot of the times this results in people coming to fallacious conclusions. So I guess you're essentially looking at 2 types of models. One is a biological constructivist model, i.e. this idea that you're a combination of the attributes of your respective parents, versus my model, which is it's not a singularity, it's a singular potential, or a unitary potential form. So you're connected to your parents in the sense that they have similar attributes as you, and that's why your quantum consciousness was able to harmonize with their genetics, but you're still representative of a different entity than either of your parents. So there's basically no way to construct an equation between the attributes of your parents that will give you as the answer, because there's something in you that is distinct from either of your parents.
Yeah, and then that's why I said the layering, whether the genetic, material, and spiritual layering are one and the same, or in fact they're parallel systems that operate simultaneously, but are in fact governed by different rules, or relatively separate. The origin of the molecular components that make up our physical body, the origin of the genetic material that is determinative of many features of the physical body, and the origin of the spiritual soul, this combination of states that make up our current spirit. And you're saying that if they're one and the same, or a combination of factors, or in fact they're three parallel simultaneous systems that just overlap and have little to do with each other.
Yeah, and this may ultimately come back down to what our respective conceptualizations of God are. And it appears that for a lot of people, they believe that the origin of their soul is God, and that God exists outside of the material universe. So it does appear that these axiomatic beliefs inform the results, or at least the interpretation of the scientific results that we observe. So maybe that's what's happening right now. We're coming at this from two different axiomatic backgrounds, and we're coming to different conclusions based on the axioms. Am I correct in assuming that you believe God is essentially apart from the universe?
I'm not sure. I have my bias, I guess I'd call it, based on my personal feel and experience of how I experience myself, and the different traditions or sages that I've read and respected. But no, I don't have enough of a basis to have anything more than a bias. I'm still in largely the research phase that I have no clue how to answer these questions. Just the fact that I'm asking the right question would be a reasonable step in accomplishment. And then on a certain level, if you look, okay, I watched E. Michael Jones talk to some like Russian Kabbalist, and this Kabbalist was mentioning how he thinks there's only like a few hundred or few thousand people in the whole world who are thinking about these ideas. And for quantum consciousness, it's probably a similar type thing where there might be millions of people who've read a few articles or have a background to understand a little bit, but there's probably only thousands of people across the world that are actually thinking about it. And if it's miraculous that me and you met through circumstance, Bab's cast or whatever, to meet, and the likely, I would say, okay, like maybe me and you were on no apologies, and like whatever reason he doesn't like me, and but either way, I doubt he has. Even if you maintained a friendship with him, he's not going to push forward these ideas. Like maybe even JF, if we went on JF's show and he's got a background in neurobiology, I even doubt that him or anyone watching his show would probably be too much interested to push forward these ideas, although it's possible, so it's like none of the people that are watching us or in our circles are going to be of any benefit to pushing forward these ideas. However, so we're just preparing ourselves to eventually speak to Hamarov, or try to enter the circles of, so to say, the Hamarov circles of the top scientists in the world who are publishing papers and researching this. Or is it possible that Penelope or Will to Power or something is going to take an extreme interest and dedicate the huge amount of time necessary to help push these ideas forward? And so it's just interesting thinking about that. Just thinking like basically this whole thing, like we have because of the multiplicity of layering of factors of who we are and what we're dealing with in real life and in streaming, versus like the main thing that's holding us together is pushing forward these ideas. But basically the whole purpose of these weekend reviews is like a prep till eventually we talk to Hamarov, and then Hamarov says like, okay, you got it, and then you're touching on interesting things, and then we move into the more accepted circles of the people that are publishing papers on these ideas, or or maybe there is no end game to this. That it's just interesting to talk about, and I'm not sure what your thoughts are on that.
Well, I choose to practice non-attachment, so even if nobody accepts the theory, I'm still going to continue to study it and develop my ideas. And this idea that not too many people are interested in quantum consciousness, if the quantum mind hypothesis is true, it actually doesn't matter, because when enough people believe that this is how the mind operates, everyone will just spontaneously change what quantum state of awareness that they're in, and they'll assimilate our beliefs vis-a-vis the same mechanism that governs the 100th monkey effect. So you don't really need to convince everybody of something. You just need to create a community who believes the theory strongly enough. And I do think truth is on our side, so I do think we'll be successful. And eventually people will start to see how they can use this theory in their day-to-day lives, i.e. understanding things like this cognitive dissonance. I think we can all agree that cognitive dissonance is not a very pleasurable sensation to experience. And so if people want to diminish their own personal suffering, they may be able to be persuaded to go on a path of understanding the quantum mind in greater detail. And that will...
That's what I said over the last few weeks, that embracing dissonance is where free will exists. In order to solve these complicated issues, really you have to have a lifetime of embracement of dissonance.
It's true. It's there's a lot of dissonant opinions out there. So we
I
have
think just to embrace it, that I embrace the dissonance in this thing, that, okay, it's difficult to exist in a state of dissonance, but I've determined the only way to move forward is to be in this constant state of dissonance. And especially we're trying to answer the most difficult of all questions, really, like the hard problem of consciousness is basically probably the most difficult of all questions facing humanity today. And so you're saying, I'm going to accept being in this state of dissonance until I could answer this unanswerable question. Likely we'll be in dissonance the rest of our lives.
Yeah, and I'm okay with that. It's just my tradition. And even if it's the hardest question anyone has ever asked in all of the history of humanity, I'm not afraid to try to answer it. And I'm really glad that you've decided to be brave as well and to go on this path towards answering the question, because I do think you have a lot to offer, both to your own people and to society at large. So thank you very much for continuing to be willing to have these conversations. I think it's a very optimism inspiring phenomenon. And I do like your idea of having our goal to be to talk to Hameroff, who knows, maybe he'll be interested in streaming with us maybe once, maybe more than once, and he can go into his ideas, because I would just love to hear not only about the specifics of his theory, but also his own personal experience, just to kind of see what led him to approach the subject in that manner, because he's taken an essentially different route than we have. We've come at it from a independent scholar / theologian perspective, whereas he's come at it from a more of a pragmatic perspective, because he's an anesthesiologist. So it'd be really great just to get to know him and maybe grow the community and build on that basis of knowledge going forward. So yeah, maybe we can wrap it up for now. And I started to write a few articles this week, but I got a bit distracted. So I'm going to try to buckle down and finish some of these articles that I have started, and I'd like to get to the end of them. I'm hoping that this, unending internet drama can kind of quiet down, at least to the point where I'm spending more than 50% of my time on intellectual pursuits rather than dealing with defamatory accusations. But maybe I can take a lesson from Mr. Greenblatt there and just ignore the trolls, because obviously they're not really bringing anything to the table. Claire's basically just insulting the quantum mind hypothesis. She doesn't think it has any utility. I'm really glad that you do think that it has some utility. So I'm always, as usual, very honored to hear your takes on things. So if you had any last words for the audience before we wrap it up for this week.
Yeah, I think it was a good conversation, and maybe, streaming wise, we're going to be moving in different directions where our streams, besides, like talking about consciousness or whatever, we're not going to be talking to the same people. We're going to be moving into our own areas of interest. And, hopefully it'll still be interesting to get back together and kind of, it's beneficial to be retrospective and to run things past another person for an objective view, and to, maybe tie it together into our common mission to solve this hard problem of consciousness, working on these theories of reincarnation and quantum consciousness. I hope that some of the common people, like I think Claire, Babs, Kyle, only like through participating in something like this week in review will we be able to hold these conversations together. Like No Apologies kind of like coming on where he's like, nah, I hate Doovid. And where that might be his dissonance now, where he basically, his pattern thinking enters fight or flight with me in it, where however he sees the world doesn't, he just looks at the world would be, it's too difficult with me and his world, which to me, that I guess that's natural. But I think this concept of a week in review would actually benefit people to to go through this process where you don't have to like me, we don't have to be friends, we don't have to like each other, just like but to say, like, what are we doing, who are we talking with, what are we accomplishing, what are we getting out of doing it. And I think that's beneficial in and of itself. And then me and you have been able to build this rapport with this concept of dissonance and understanding our own difficulties in the material world and struggling with difficult people and achieving our objectives, to try to base that, our own personal experience, to working, using ourself as kind of like a test lab sample to try to solve this mystery of quantum consciousness. So I think that's interesting. And hopefully, this week seemed a little, like no one seemed to participate. Like Penelope, I'm glad she was there, some of the people, but we could get people into this week in review concept where people, just want to pop on, kind of say, like, what are they doing? What are they trying to accomplish? How is that, pushing forward ideas? And, so hopefully over the next few weeks, there'll be people who will join in and could have kind of like a friendly agree to disagree, and just, and then we'll be able to try to tie this in using ourselves and other people who agree to it to be kind of like lab examples in our open Freudian, experience to try to solve this mystery.
Yeah, scientific religion where we make ourselves guinea pigs. Thank you so much, Doovid, for coming to join us on the stream. Thanks for the audience for tuning in. We'll look forward to seeing you at the very latest on the next week in review. Looking forward to hearing your questions and feedback. And if you'd like to come on the show, please reach out. We're always happy to talk to new people, even if you don't have a lot of experience. I know it can be a bit intimidating because people aren't used to talking about these things, but it's by having these conversations that we can really move things forward. And you never know, you might know more than you think you do. So thank you so much for tuning in. Take care, everyone, and bye-bye for now.